By the word of truth, that we may be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
Reading from the Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
When Jesus came to the territory of the Gadarenes, 2 demoniacs who were coming from the tombs met him. They were so savage that no one could travel by that road. They cried out, "What have you to do with us, Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the appointed time?" Some distance away, a herd of many swine was feeding. The demons pleaded with him, "If you drive us out, send us into the herd of swine." And he said to them, "Go then." They came out and entered the swine, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, where they drowned. The swineherds ran away, and when they came to the town, they reported everything, including what had happened to the demoniacs. Thereupon the whole town came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they begged him to leave their district. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Aquí dice que cuando Abraham tuvo el hijo Isaac tenía 100 años, que significa que todavía hay posibilidades para la gran mayoría de los que están aquí reunidos en esta misa de aquí. Mr. Salas, no, acuérdate de los niños. You know, when I was growing up as a kid, I was convinced that my family was perfect. At least that was my experience. I came from a very close-knit family. There wasn't a single Sunday where we didn't miss. And I remember going to Mass with my grandparents and seeing my aunts and uncles at Mass. I was, from a very early age, taught the importance of family. The activities that we had were always family-oriented. When we went to my grandparents' house on Sundays, and when we would have different events, there were beautiful traditions in my family that were kept religiously during Christmas and Thanksgiving. I remember the relationship between my mother's side of the family and my father's side of the family was very beautiful and it was beautiful. And I grew up in a very close-knit family, my brothers and sisters, and I took great pride in the Garcia Tuñón family and the history of it and what it was able to overcome over the years, after my grandfather having to leave Spain because of the Spanish Civil War and getting to Cuba and then leaving Cuba and coming to Miami and making it as a successful engineer and businessman. That was my understanding of my family as I was growing up. It was perfect. And then, as I got older, my eyes began to open, and I began to realize that my family was not as perfect as I thought. My parents had done a very good job of keeping me away from certain things of the family history that there was no reason for me to know it at the time. But then the older I got, I began to hear some stories as to what the real reason why one of my uncles didn't live in Miami anymore. Or one of the real reasons why one of my great aunt's husbands was no longer with us. And all of a sudden I begin to find out that this happened over here and this happened over there, and one family member who died by suicide, I had no idea. Another family member who had gotten divorced, I had no idea. Another family member who had actually gotten married because they had gotten pregnant, I had no idea. And as a matter of fact, you even find out that my grandfather's grandfather, so what is that, my great-great-grandfather, died in a duel where he had to face the husband of the woman that he had had an affair with. And I'm thinking to myself, how is this possible? My family and all those imperfections and all those problems and all those sinful moments and sinful events, At that point, I began to say to myself, my God, it's a wonder I became a priest at all, with that kind of a history. And yet, if you read the Old Testament, you began to realize how sinful, how dysfunctional the history of God's chosen people actually is. Read today's reading from the book of Genesis, and a casual reading of it makes you realize how dysfunctional the first steps of the people of Israel actually were. How do you justify Abraham having a child out of wedlock and then having his wife force him to have his own son and the mother of his son leave and to be banished, to fend for themselves in the desert? That sounds pretty dysfunctional to me. As a matter of fact, if you go to the Gospel of St. Matthew, the first chapter, Matthew does a great job of giving you Jesus's genealogy. And if you really take a look at Jesus's genealogy, his family's background is pretty dysfunctional. Do you know that in the family line of Jesus, there is a prostitute, Rahab. There is a pagan foreigner in Ruth. And there's even an adulterer and murderer in David. This is the lineage of Jesus, the Son of God. It just goes to show, Father Marcelino Garcia, who has a tendency of saying very funny things, he has this one expression when he says, todo mundo tiene su caquita. Every family has its little stain. And it's true. If you were to look at your own family history, you look at your family, either most recently or go down the line, who of us does not have those moments or those individuals who are not in line with our moral values or our Catholic, Christian, religious upbringing? We all have it. And yet in the midst of that disorder, and in the midst of that chaos, and in the midst of that sin, God has a tendency of providing the world incredibly graceful moments. The expression that I've heard so many times as I was growing up as a kid from my grandmother, que Dios escribe recto con líneas torcidas. And that's exactly what it is. My history and my background, I become more aware of it and have a much more mature perspective of it when I realize that it's far from being perfect. And yet in the midst of that imperfection, God does some extraordinary things. And this is the story of the history of Israel. This is the story of God's chosen people. When we read the Old Testament and read some of these very scandalous stories in Genesis and Exodus, some of the scandalous stories that you hear in the book of Kings and in the book of Judges, you begin to realize that in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the sinfulness, in the midst of the moments of disgrace, you can very powerfully find the loving hand of God guiding His people, and continuously. It is a story of betrayal, adultery, murder, sinfulness. And yet these are the people that God has chosen to be His own. It's the experience of what St. Paul says, that where there is disgrace, grace abounds. But grace abounds when we're able to recognize it and see it. You know, I think there's a reason why we're called to be so very compassionate, merciful, and forgiving. Because we know that even in the midst of our weakness, God can produce some extraordinary things. It's where grace can really be experienced in these moments of disgrace. I had an experience just now. I came back on Monday from the mission trip to the Dominican Republic. There were 77 people in total on this mission trip, lost up in the mountains of the Dominican Republic in the province of Jarabacoa for the construction of this bridge. And we were staying in a little town called La Estancita. I had 65 young men. The rest were adults who made up this group of 77. And it's amazing how you can see God's very powerful grace in the presence of such disgraceful situations. The poverty, the corruption, the difficulties in being able to get food or clean water, or to be able to transport people who are sick. And yet in the midst of all of this, it's extraordinary to see how God's grace abounds, and to see how the kids are able to experience it every single day that they were there. One of the things that I do on this trip is that at the end of the day, after we finish work, right before dinner, we have Mass every day with the kids. And I normally don't preach at these Masses. I give the kids an opportunity to just express what they saw during the day and encourage them to tell me where they saw God today. The campesino, the work, whatever it is. And it's amazing to see how these kids begin to process things, because you kind of force them into a situation where they have to make a connection between what I saw today, the poverty and the sadness that I saw today, and make a necessary connection to the great presence of God in that day. And it's amazing to see how that works and how the Holy Spirit makes it happen. I remember this one particular moment. I went down into the town to buy the food for that evening's dinner. And it's the only moment that I would get reception on my cell phone. And a message had come into my cell phone telling me that the grandmother of 3 of the students had passed away. And if I could communicate that information to them and offer the Mass that evening for the repose of her soul. And I remember that as I came up the mountain, I grabbed the 3 young men and I told them that their grandmother had passed away. And they were very saddened by this. So that evening, we're celebrating the Mass, and it happened to be the feast of Saints Peter and Paul. And I had mentioned at the beginning of the Mass that it was the feast of Saint Peter and Paul, and that Peter and Paul were the 2 columns of the church. That our church stood very firmly on these 2 columns, these 2 men, and what they represented, and the significance of their vocations and their lives to the Catholic Church. And at one point in the sharing session, one of the grandsons, as he's processing the death of his grandmother, stood up and he had said that he had come very close to asking me to send him back to Miami to be with his family. But he had felt like he needed to be where he was, and that his grandmother would have preferred to him stay where he was and work with these people. He says that I realized that it wasn't a coincidence that my grandmother died on the feast of St. Peter and Paul. Just because the same way that they were columns of the church, my grandmother was the column of our family. And that it was appropriate that if she was going to pass away, that it be on that day. The ability to discover the grace of God in the midst of what most people would consider a disgrace. The death of a member of your family. You know, this is what Ignatius of Loyola calls us to. The whole idea of being able to find God in all things is not simply reserved for finding God in those extraordinary moments in our lives. Ignatius encourages us to find God even present in the moments of disgrace, in the moments of sadness, in the moments where we feel abandoned, or the moments where we feel angry, or the moments where we feel tempted, in the moments that we suffer. That's where the challenge is. It's easy to find God in these incredibly grace-filled moments. Where do we find Him in the moments of sadness, in the moments of suffering? This is what Ignatius encourages us to do. Can we find God in the history of Israel with all its difficulties and what seems like moments of injustice or sadness or disgrace? Absolutely. He was present all along, throughout the whole process. Can we find Him in our daily lives today? Absolutely. Even in those most difficult, most sorrowful, most sufferable of moments, the hand of God is necessarily present, and we're called to find it.